Hello, today's a sunny November afternoon, so I thought I'd come out and do a video on my experiences transplanting cold hardy palms. So to start with, I'd like to say that this is my garden and I am a landscape gardener. So over the years I've dug up and moved quite a few large palms, mainly Trachycarpus fortunei, and brought them to my garden. Plus I have done the same process in a few customers' gardens and family members. So the first thing I'd like to say is sort of why would people want to dig up these palms and transplant them? Well, I think to start with, a lot of people would go to a garden centre or nursery and buy a palm about this size, which is a Trachycarpus fortunei, this example. Now they will go and plant it in the garden, not really knowing the sort of overall sizes that they can reach, and they can obviously grow like that. In the UK, they're quite often planted in front gardens, or maybe too near to the house, or in front of windows, and they get big, and then people sort of then put them on eBay and places like that to try and sell them, thinking that they can get real good money for them because they probably see the prices for a similar plant in a nursery. So here's an example of a Trachycarpus fortunei that I transplanted about 6 years ago to my own garden. I brought it off an eBay seller. I can't remember the price now, but it was in the front garden. It had outgrown the space, so I went and dug it up, brought it back. Now in that case, I dug it up, getting a good root ball, reduced lots of the leaves, brought it back here and planted it up straight away. It would have probably been early summertime, kept it well watered, and to be honest, this one compared to some of the others transplanted really well. It didn't really deteriorate in any way, but as with most palms, if you move them, they will go sort of stagnant for probably about 3 years. You won't find any leaf growth or anything because it's going to concentrate on putting new roots down. So generally, if you're buying a large Trachycarpus, especially in Europe, they would have been grown in fields and then redug up when they're larger, potted up and then sold with very small root balls compared to the sort of trunk and top growth. So Trachycarpus does transplant well, but there is better ways of doing it. So for instance, if I wanted to move this one in my own garden for any reason, I don't by the way, but if I did, probably the best procedure to do it would be in spring. We'd do what we call the moat technique, where you sort of dig a 1 foot trench all the way around the bottom of the palm, and then get rid of that soil, backfill it, and then leave it again for about 3 or 4 months. Now what this tends to do is it tends to sever lots of the roots and then keeps the low growing roots that are going deeper into the ground intact. Now these will keep the plant looking healthy, and over the time, the next few months, the palm will produce hopefully new roots into that area that you've dug out, and then you can re-dig this probably 3 or 4 months later and dig it completely out, and it will have a lot more chance of survival. The next point I'd like to say is about the weight of these palms. They are deceivingly heavy. So for instance, if you wanted to move a palm the size of this Trachycarpus wagnerianus, you would try to get a good sized root ball, probably about, let's say 2 foot by 2 foot cubed underneath it. Try to get as much root as you possibly can, but with that it will be extremely heavy, and I've been caught out in this situation before. So many years ago I brought, if you can just see the top of it, that Trachycarpus fortunei, off eBay, and it was about that size. It probably had just over a metre to a metre and a half of trunk. And when I purchased it, I didn't have to transplant it. It was in an oak barrel. So I drove for over an hour to go and pick that palm on my own in my works van. Got there down an old country lane to meet an old couple that could not help me get this palm in. I thought I could get there, just roll it in the barrel, sort of lever it into the back of the van, and away I would go. No, this was not the case. 3 hours later, I was still trying to lever it into the back of the van, using bits of timber, blocks, everything to try and lift it up. It had the full root ball of a full-size oak barrel full of soil, and it was really root bound. And in the end, I just could not move it. I could not lift it. I could not leave it. So I decided to smash the barrel up, and I got the top end of the palm into the back of my van. So for instance, if it was this size, this top end was strapped to the back of my van. The trunk and the whole barrel sized root ball was still hanging out of the back of my van on the floor. I could not figure out any way of getting this palm, so I then decided to drag this palm for about approximately a mile down a very old country lane to a main road at the bottom, where I sat for a little while, and very fortunately for me, a truck was coming past with a high ab crane on the back. I flagged it down, said to the driver I would offer him £20 if he strapped it up and helped me get it into the back of the van, which he really nicely did. Got it into the back of the van, brought it back here, dug out a metre cube of hole to get it in, and there it is, probably 8 years later. Now, that was my lesson learned. These things weigh a lot. The trunks do, the root balls do. If you ever have to move one, just get a, if you've got a mini digger or something that could really aid in the moving of it, that would be brilliant. And by the way, while my camera's on there, I've just noticed, which is a first for me, this Trachycarpus wagnerianus is flowering at the end of November, which is not normal. Just starting to push out. There. Normally that would be spring, so I'll have to check my others. I'm not really sure why that's happening. So if you do ever have to move one, I would say if you're getting any that's bigger than that, they're going to start to get heavier. This one obviously for most people should be manageable, but once they start getting to over a metre of a trunk with a root ball, they really are a challenge. So next I'd like to talk about transplanting one of the other cold hardy palms, and that is Chamaerops humilis. Some people would say Chamaerops or Chamaerops. It all depends on your pronunciation. I tend to call it Chamaerops because, as far as I know, in Latin they used to pronounce the letter C like a hard sort of K, which made more of a K sound rather than the sh from champagne. But going back to topic, in my experience moving this plant, if you try to move a larger specimen, so for example, I will show you one around here that I have moved. So this is one I moved a few years ago. It was in a customer's garden. It was growing too near the trampoline. These do have quite bad spikes on it, so they asked me if I could dig it up and move it. It struggled like mad really, so I did get a large root ball with it. But what tends to happen with Chamaerops humilis rather than Trachycarpus fortunei is if you sever the roots on a Chamaerops, the root tends to die as far as I'm aware, and it has to regenerate new roots right back to the base of the plant. So even if you try to get a good sized root ball, they can still die off. And with a largish trunk like that, which is probably nearly a metre long, it tends to not have hardly any roots, and they deteriorate quite quickly, to be fair. So looking at this one, after all these years later, it's still clinging on, and it's finally deciding to start growing now the weather's cooler. It hasn't done anything in this hot summer, but seems to be now the cooler weather's getting here, finally putting out some growth. How that does during winter, I don't really know. Here's the Chamaerops cerifera that I moved from my front garden to the back garden as I was having work done out the front. Now this was planted at the beginning of the year. We've had a really hot summer. It hasn't really liked it. As you can see, lots of brown leaves on it, but all the new spears coming out the middle are solid and blue, and that is new growth. But this is a lot smaller palm than the other one that I moved, and I've moved a few others that are larger, and they have all struggled. I've planted one in my brother-in-law's garden, and that had about a metre or so of trunk, and in the first year it lost nearly every leaf apart from the ones coming from the base of the trunk. So to summarise, I wouldn't recommend to anyone to transplant a palm. It is possible, it is doable with these two varieties. Some of the varieties like Brahea Mata are well known that they don't like root disturbance, and there's probably many more. I can only give experience on these varieties because these are the two types I've transplanted in the past. But realistically, I would most definitely say you're better off starting with palms of these sort of sizes, either small like that or the next stage up, because I've said this in the past many times, they will outgrow palms that you tend to buy this size, whether you've transplanted it or whether it's that size in a garden centre and in a small pot. The reason you're going to pay a lot of money in nurseries is because these are slow growing. So for example, that's one of my seed grown Trachycarpus there, and that's probably took about 3 years to get to that size, and then up to that next size which I've seed grown maybe 6 years. So you're paying for the nursery's time and effort to get them to these larger sizes. So like I say, I wouldn't recommend transplanting palms by any means. Sometimes it's doable, but in general, you know, get good healthy plants in pots and just watch them grow. So I'm going to finish off with Cordyline australis, which actually isn't really a palm, even though it's classed as like the Torbay palm. Now, I often see these sold on eBay in the UK, maybe not this size, but large specimens. They put them up for £600-700. Come and dig up and collect. My message to you is don't bother. These are very different to Trachycarpus fortunei. They tend to have more of a tap root system, much bigger roots. They don't have the fibrous roots that the Trachycarpus does. So lots of people that I know have tried to dig them up, have not had success. They move them, replant them, and within 6 months they're pretty much dead. You may be lucky enough that they send out shoots from lower down, but in general they are not worth the hassle. So this is a little bit of a different video, just from some of my experiences in the past. I hope you like it. Any questions, leave a comment. Thank you very much.